Yeah, I mean, I think there are a bunch of things, but the kind of, so I approach this historically, and I wanted to kind of figure out, how was this system for Chinese diplomats designed, and how did a country which was so concerned about potential hostile outside influences manage to put together an apparatus which was designed to deal with the outside world. So I started, I was doing interviews in Beijing, as part of my day job, but then I also started looking for written sources, and there was this. I knew that there were a couple of memoirs written by former Chinese foreign ministers and ambassadors, and the more I started to look into it, I discovered that there are a ton of these books, more than 100 that I used in my research, and I know that there are dozens that I never got around to reading as well. Memoirs by former Chinese diplomats, from people who were in the cultural section in the embassy in New Zealand to people who served, in sub-Saharan Africa or North America, and a whole kind of span of Chinese activities. So I started to kind of mine these books for insights into how China's diplomatic service worked, and it became clear that there was this kind of founding ethos which was incredibly powerful. It was laid down in 1949 by Zhou Enlai, the People's Republic's first foreign minister, and he faced this challenge, like I said, of creating a system where diplomats were capable of navigating those two worlds. And the additional fact that China didn't have any diplomats. It had booted out all of the small number of nationalist diplomats who had stayed behind after the revolution. And it had a group of people who had spent decades, fighting the nationalist government and the Japanese, using guerrilla warfare. And it had a bunch of fresh students who many of whom had never been overseas, some of whom had never met a foreigner before. So his ethos that he came up with was that China's diplomatic corps should think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. So they should emulate the fighting force that had propelled them to power. And what he meant by that, I think, was that, like the PLA, which is of course a party army, it answers to the Communist Party, not to the Chinese state, that Chinese diplomats should be unfailingly loyal to CCP leadership, that they should be disciplined to a fault, and that they should display what he called a fighting spirit whenever China's interests were challenged. And so I think that kind of set up a system which was extraordinarily responsive to the diktats of senior Chinese leaders. And at times, that discipline has been applied to charming the world. You think of the 1950s when China charmed the developing world and non-aligned countries, or you think of the 1990s when China rehabilitated its global image after the Tiananmen massacre, and of course that culminated in it hosting the 2008 Summer Olympics. At other times, when China's political system has kind of turned inwards and there have been purges, crackdowns, political movements like the Cultural Revolution, where suddenly ideology becomes all important, and showing your loyalty to the number one leader, whether that's Mao or whether it's Xi, becomes very important. Chinese diplomats stop focusing on charming the world, and they start focusing on looking after their own skins, and also advancing their own careers. And the best way to do that, in Mao's China, it was to be a kind of highly ideological, passionate communist and hand out copies of Mao's Red Book and shout at the Soviets for not understanding communism properly. And now it's to get pretty angry with anyone who dares to disagree with China. And so I guess the core argument is that system that Zhou set up in 1949 created an incentive structure where at times of political uncertainty, Chinese diplomats would start acting in a way that we would now call wolf warrior diplomacy.